your reflections on the election and where we go from here. And one of the things that I like that you've done, Bill, and I'm going to have you elaborate, is I've been kind of trying over the past couple of weeks to make this argument that in terms of figuring the fallout of this, it's all of the above. It is a failure of neoliberalism. It is about economics. It's also absolutely about misogyny, racism, and a fear of an America that looks different and feels different. It's all of these things simultaneously. You kind of spelled that out, and I'm wondering if you can kind of, and you also began on an encouraging note. So can you kind of give us your sort of main sweep and takeaways of this election and where we are now?
Well, let me start at the end. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because actually we won.
Right.
When you look at the election results, Hillary at this point is 2 million votes ahead and climbing.
Yep.
And it's gotten so bad for Trump that he now issues a statement that that 3 million people, he claims, voted illegally, and supplies no evidence, of course.
Totally unfair.
So he's completely unhinged by what's going on. So
right.
I actually think that the elements of the new majority are clearly emerging. That there were problems in the Clinton campaign. There were big mistakes like not going to Wisconsin. There were things that were out of their control, like the FBI note, which I'm convinced had an impact because before that note, they were on a roll.
Right.
And that note really jammed them.
Yep.
And even when it came out right before the election that there was nothing. But it didn't matter at that point because it was one more stain. The election, yes, was about neoliberalism, but what I found most interesting about this was the exit polls in terms of what were the issues of greatest concern for Trump voters. And there were two. And they weren't economic.
Yep.
Immigration and terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And once I saw that, then a lot of other things kind of came together. That what we were witnessing was an election that actually could have gone either way. The election results were so close that it really, it was a toss-up. It could have gone either way. And for that reason, we have to be very careful about how we summarize this and not make too many sweeping conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I would say that this was a white nationalist, right-wing populist uprising where you had a candidate who tapped into the fears of the future among whites. And he tapped into their fears. Let me tell you something, Michael. There was a letter that a friend of mine sent me from a railroad worker who was writing to his union. And the guy said he had voted for Obama in the past. He was voting for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
That he was voting for Trump because he was voting for his son and his son's future. And I found that actually phenomenal because basically what this guy was saying was that despite the fact that Trump ran the most misogynist, racist, xenophobic campaign since George Wallace,
mm-hmm.
that all could be excused because somehow he was better for this guy's son than Hillary. And I think this sort of fear of the future, fear of collapse, fear of the changing demographics became a rallying cry for Trump because certain things just don't make any sense. It's like Trump calling Hillary crooked and always crooked Hillary.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this guy. Look at what he's doing now. Look at what he was doing before. Look at what happened with Trump University. Look at these issues about possible ties with the five families. Look at these things, and this information was out there, and it wasn't like it was a secret. But despite that, and despite this, despite the racism, sexism, etc., people voted for him. And my conclusion was that a significant part of his base was deplorable. They are people that voted for him precisely because of the misogyny, precisely because of the racism. One of the things in terms of gender, misogyny, which is I find very troubling, is when women who voted for Trump were asked about his misogyny, they skipped around that. And they talked about their anger or their hatred of Hillary Clinton. But think about it for a second. How many of them were ever able to pin down why they hated Hillary? They couldn't. I mean, I listened to countless, and they couldn't. And I think that's where you're talking about internalized oppression that exists.
Do you I don't disagree with that in the sense that I think, and as I said, I guess this is also just reflects my my usual way of thinking in a way for good and for ill, which is that I'm a I'm a synthesizer and I'm sort of looking at as many variables as possible. Do you think though, and because one of the things that's interested me, and one of the, I think in some ways the mistakes that have been made in the fallout of this is I think to a certain extent there has been too much attention paid to the Trump voter in general. I think that there might be a small percentage of people who voted for Obama, and maybe they could migrate back with an economic message. But I think overall, not only is it deplorable, I think also overall it's and I'm trying to make a little bit of a distinction here. It's Republicans. Republicans voted for the nominee in a very typical way. What strikes me and where the neoliberalism piece comes in, and I talked about this last week, the New York Times went to Milwaukee and they spoke to several African-American voters, and granted, it's totally qualitative, but several of the voters they talked to didn't vote. And it was a combination of absolutely voter suppression played a real role because it made the process much more difficult. And that's another thing that we have to obviously, we're going to see a lot of that under this administration. And then, but number two, there was just this sort of sense of like, I like the symbolism of Obama. That was great. The economy is terrible. No one's delivering. It's not worth it. And it does seem to me that at least, and this is another maybe questionable, well, I'll just make the analogy. When we talk about terrorism in the Middle East as an example, there's always been the argument that, of course, there are some people and some groups that maybe have an innate fanatic ideology, and that's just what they're going to do, even in very favorable conditions. But the counterpoint, and that's true, there is ideology. But the counterpoint is that toxic ideologies are more susceptible when the immune system is bad. And so I guess that's where I'm wondering, does the neoliberal piece come in there? That in general, if things are actually working better, is the type of, beyond, I think, what could be 35, 40% of the electorate, which really are voting on white nationalism, because I do think fundamentally the party of Republicanism is a white identity party, but that we make ourselves susceptible to it to some degree by doing nothing or so little on economics, poverty, and neoliberalism.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a couple of points here. So it's interesting the way you frame it, because that's also the way that I frame it. I say that right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. that when capitalism as a system weakens, the virus emerges in all of its forms.
Right.
And that is what we've seen time and again in U.S. history, that when the system is weakened, usually by economic crises or something else, that's when this virus really becomes prevalent. So I think that you're absolutely right. I think that the neoliberal globalization has shaken people in so many ways, but it's not limited to what Trump was talking about with trade agreements. It's also about the way automation has been used.
Yes.
It's also about privatization, casualization. anti-unionism. It's all of these things together that have destabilized people's existence. And the sense that things are out of control, and then you add on to that an environmental crisis, and people feel like, my God, I don't understand it anymore. Please take us back to the era of the Donna Reed show. and so thus enters from stage right Donald Trump. And so I think that that's true. Now, but to go back to the first point that you were raising, I think that the interviews that the Times conducted demonstrated that Hillary was not the candidate to lead an anti-corporate populist movement, even though she's gotten more votes than Trump.
Right.
She was not the person. That part of what happened was a failure to more fully mobilize the base. And I think that there was some level of people feeling that she was going to win. There was no real need to vote. And just think about what the opinion polls have been saying, right?
Yeah.
And so, if I don't feel strongly about her and she's going to win anyway, then what the hell? I can go to a movie for the day,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was an element. I think that there was also an element of people that were angry with the policies under Bill Clinton, for which they were holding her responsible. I think that was another factor. I think that there was anger about what happened with the Sanders campaign,
Mm-hmm.
and issues about the Democratic National Committee. So there were a number of factors that undermined this. No doubt, the issue of neoliberalism, just to go full circle, is a neoliberal globalization is something that any kind of social movement going forward is going to have to address, not primarily in order to win the Trump voter. Because, see, I'd go further than you. I'd say that, when I look at the vote was actually about 25% of the eligible voters in this country voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of core of very reactionary voters is pretty consistent.
Right.
So again, not to just create lemonade out of lemons, but I think we have to understand 75% of the potential voters voted against Trump or didn't vote. And so it's the people that didn't vote that were eligible that we have to really concentrate on. And there needs to be a message that resonates with them, a message of hope. And I think, unfortunately, the Clinton campaign, although hope was central to how she presented things at the Democratic Convention, the campaign focused much too much on how evil and erratic Trump was, as opposed to what it was that she was proposing for the future.
Right. We've actually said a lot in some ways to just, and it's funny because some of the pieces that have come out recently saying that how Berlusconi was contained in Italy was by just starting to treat him like another, bad right-wing politician instead of all this kind of added drama, even if it's warranted.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.